In this video we are going to take a closer look at the 5th release of the Balance Dataslate and its corresponding GW Metawatch article and video coverage published mid-October that turned out to be a major disappointment to say the very least. Over the course of the video we will briefly look at what changed and what GW has to say about it, focusing on Space Marines and with that of course the Deathwatch. In the second part, we will then discuss what we can likely still expect for Space Marines and Deathwatch in the coming months. At the end of the video, I will also go through what I am currently working on for Deathwatch, before concluding with a quick wrap up as usual.
Welcome to SwissHammer, your channel for modeling in Warhammer 40k. My name is Tammer and I will be guiding you through this video.
Back in November last year, GW surprised us with the first release of the so-called Balance Dataslate, an additional layer of rules that is supposed to help balance the great many factions in Warhammer 40k. As I already discussed during my latest monthly tournament coverage, the aim of GW is to keep faction win rates in the range of 45 to 55%. For this, they currently have several tools available outside of their regular codex and supplement releases. The mentioned Balance Dataslate, FAQs and the Munitorum Field Manual, which holds the points values. All these three are available for free online on Warhammer Community, which gives them much more flexible control when compared to printed book releases. In theory, this is a good thing, but as we will see in just a moment, it is by no means a guarantee that they will get their balancing right anyway. While balanced dataslates were supposed to be released quarterly, they had a bit of an odd schedule for this first full year. The first three releases followed in relatively short order: Q1 early February, Q2 mid-April, Q3 end of June, which resulted in the fourth one coming out comparably late. Back in the initial Metawatch article leading up to the fourth release this year, win rate percentages showed both the Clowns and Nits as overperformers, while both AdMech and Space Marines were clearly underperforming. Naturally, these four factions raised the most speculations about potential changes. I have covered this to some degree in a previous video, the link is in the description. Long story short, what actually changed? The short answer is that from a pinpoint strike at Leviathan High Fleet lists aside, very little. For Space Marines in particular, there was a minor boost to the secondary objective shock tactics, which now awards more victory points. How exactly GW thinks that this will help Space Marine win rates is beyond me to guess, and as a result, I crawled my way through the 20-minute long Metawatch video in order to find out. In short, as we already know based on the previous release, GW partly blames poor Space Marine win rates on the players themselves, namely a lot of beginners picking up this faction, and in turn the average player being more used to playing against Space Marines. As I already mentioned in my tournament coverage video, we have had quite solid tournament data over months now, and Space Marines are just not doing well in the competitive scene, at which point the whole "the win rates are bad because of beginners" argument falls apart. Furthermore, GW also mentions how they are waiting for as long as possible to make any balance adjustments, and they aim for pinpoint strikes to change as little as possible at once, rather than doing a series of changes to a single faction at once. That's about it. On these later 2 points, I would say that I actually agree with the sentiment to change as little as possible. I think, as any player well knows, there are so many layers of rules and datasheets, making it very easy to cause unwanted chain reactions. On the other hand, I think even if you wanted to wait for as long as possible to actually make the change, I think you should have a general plan for any faction at that point, and then the part you do last minute is tweaking numbers. To give a more concrete example, in case of the shock tactic secondary, I think you should be aware what and how you want to change it, and what you then fine-tune at the very end is the actual number of victory points. Or with Armor of Contempt, you design the rule as a whole and then tweak values and possible exemptions. For this round of the Balance Dataslate, it feels like they just threw something random in for Space Marines, without giving any additional thought on how to improve the faction as a whole. What I also found amusing is that they kept referring to how they are consulting their playtesters and the community as a whole for these sorts of changes. I suppose in an attempt to deflect from these recent talks about how they let go of several playtesters. Needless to say that I find it highly unlikely that any serious playtester worth the description pushed for this change to shock tactics. Disappointing to say the least. Personally, I don't expect to see Space Marine win rate change for the better at all. With the actual Balance Dataslate covered, where does this leave the Deathwatch? Fortunately for us, Deathwatch is doing comparably well among the Space Marine chapters, no small thanks to our Army of Renown, the Kill Team Strike Force. As Mikkel Klangby and other veteran players have demonstrated perfectly in Warzone Nephilim, you can win tournaments as Deathwatch, partly due to the decent rules, and partly because our opponents don't know us that well, yet. The Balance Dataslate did not give us scarier opponents, on the contrary, it pulled the Tyranid 2 for 2, even though they remain a very strong faction regardless. With the Space Dwarves getting their wider range of miniatures, and the Guard Codex around the corner as well, it remains to be seen how well we will play into these two with our existing and by now pretty aged toolset. Shock Tactics was not among the top picks for secondaries for Deathwatch, and even the mild boost will not elevate it to that. Fortunately for us, Warzone Nephilim has given us solid options, the Long Vigil certainly being the current top pick in most situations. What perhaps is the greatest concern for Deathwatch at this point is the upcoming January, when as it currently stands, the Army of Renown will expire. I have covered this in more detail in a previous video, the link is in the description. However, the one good news from sitting through that Metawatch video was at least a confirmation that GW will release the next points updates in January. This means something is definitely happening then. Whether that includes additional FAQs they did not say, but perhaps it is the right time to start praying to the God Emperor that they will not forget about the Deathwatch for once. Should we lose the Kill Team Strike Force, we will be at a major impasse. On the other hand, if they would just drop Space Marine points enough, troops in particular, we should also see a major boost to kill teams, and of course the specialisms remain at a discount and available outside of the Army of Renown as an optional pick. Furthermore, as was previewed on Warhammer Day early in October, GW plans the release of so-called boarding action games at 500 points, using rules that will be available in the upcoming Arcs of Omen books. While I have been sticking to 2k points for the most part myself, I have to admit that I am very intrigued by this upcoming game mode, and from various comments on my channel, I know that I am far the only one interested in the prospect of smaller 500 point games on cool looking Space Hulk style boards. While I would not necessarily advocate for Deathwatch scaling well at lower points, I have to say the restriction to forbid monsters and vehicles in boarding actions is very interesting for Deathwatch, as we can of course bring the main strength of our army, the kill teams. I cannot help wondering whether bikes will be allowed or not, and of course our very own special version of those, rocking the infantry keyword rather than the biker one. While I currently won't be making any major changes to my personal list, the lack of rules does just that, I am continuing to work on additional war gear for my Proteus Kill Teams, like magnetizing additional loadouts and the swords, because I think those will be really great picks for anyone looking into playing boarding action. While I think that in 2k points games all kill teams are viable, in my opinion the Proteus kill teams are mandatory requirements to make smaller games work. That aside, I might finally tackle my second set of heavy intercessors to be able to run a second Indomitor kill team, depending on how Army of Renown rules and troops points costs go in January. To wrap things up, over the course of the video, we have looked at the 5th release of the quarterly Balance Dataslate, which has been a major disappointment as a whole, and especially so for Space Marines and in turn Deathwatch. Contrary to lowest win rate together with AdMech among all the factions, GW refuses to acknowledge any real problems with Space Marines, blaming the poor results on the players rather than the codex creep they introduced over the course of 9th edition. Have to sell those Space Dwarves, I guess. With only a minor boost to the shock tactics secondary for Space Marines, the situation remains largely unchanged for Deathwatch. We do comparably well for being Space Marines. Thanks to our Army of Renown, we already have a solid selection of secondaries, and it basically remains to be seen how we will do playing into the Space Dwarves and the new Guard Codex. Personally, I think January will make or break it for us, depending on what happens to the Army of Renown and whether we get any meaningful point changes or not. Until then, I will personally focus on my Proteus Kill Teams, which I expect to be great for boarding actions, as well as some additional heavy intercessors, in order to run a second Indomitor kill team if required. Then last but not least, this year, GW released the Q4 Balance Dataslate in early February, so perhaps we will see that one around the same time in 2023, and perhaps by then, GW has received enough backlash from Marine players to actually make a significant change for once. So that's it for the 5th release of the quarterly balance update series for match play and its potential impact on the Deathwatch. How do you guys rate the changes to shock tactics, and what kind of changes are you making to your own lists? Let me know in the comments. Finally, I would also like to mention that there is a SwissHammer Facebook page where I will be posting links to my videos as well as articles I find of interest. I do read a lot about the hobby, but not all of it will always end up as its own video. I look forward to seeing you there as well. I do also have a Patreon page. If you like my content, any additional support is greatly appreciated as it helps me invest into future videos. As always, thank you very much for watching, guys. Your continued support is greatly appreciated. I hope you have been enjoying this video. Give me a thumbs up if you did, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thanks again and see you next time.